Welcome to the My Fishing Cape Cod podcast. The My Fishing Cape Cod podcast is your local source for the latest news and information on fishing Cape Cod. Now, here's your host, Kevin Collins.
Welcome to another edition of the My Fishing Cape Cod podcast, presented by Cape Islands Mitsubishi. I'm your host, Kevin Collins, back with you for another Fishing Report podcast. And today, we're going to have Evan Eastman of Eastman Sport and Tackle in Falmouth, Massachusetts, join us here on the MFCC podcast. And Evan, based off his shop's location, is a Falmouth expert, and he also has a ton of intel on Vineyard Sound and the Elizabeth Islands, spanning all the way over to Buzzards Bay as well. So he's a wealth of information. He was a regular guest on our weekly podcast last season, but this year we're giving Evan his own show, just like many of our other bait and tackle shop owners. So let's welcome in today's guest, Evan Eastman. As promised, our guest on today's edition of the My Fishing Cape Cod podcast is our good buddy Evan Eastman of Eastman Sport and Tackle down in beautiful Falmouth, Massachusetts. And Evan, welcome to another season of the podcast, my friend.
Thanks, Kevin. I appreciate it. Looking forward to it.
I've had a couple of early season reports from Cape Cod Bay that have been very promising. The canal seems to be doing all right, and Buzzards Bay definitely has plenty of fish in the migratory pattern of, I'll say, Buzzards Bay through the canal into Cape Cod Bay is definitely well underway. But what are things like down in your neck of the woods? Is it still predominantly kind of small fish, or are you seeing anything down there?
Yeah, for sure. I'll just start from a shore perspective. The south side, it was a little later than last year, but the south side's definitely been producing some good fish. We've seen some cinder worm spawns in the estuaries like Bourne's Pond, Green Pond, Great Pond, Waquoit Bay. There's been some other bait mixed in, so guys have been getting them inside and on the ocean side as well, you know, down off of like the Catuit area or off of like Benant Beach, all the way to like Trunk River. The last week and a half definitely has picked up considerably. Seems like there aren't any like slobs around, but definitely that like 26 to 34 inch range, definitely some slot fish, a good amount of over slot fish being caught. So it just seems like the majority of the people are casting, whether it's a soft plastic paddle tail or an SP minnow or a Yozuri long cast minnow, something white, bone colored's been the go-to so far. So shore fishing's been very good. And yeah, a lot of people are chasing the worm hatches. Any other questions before I transition to some of the boat reports?
Just had a quick question on the salt ponds, Evan. I know that's something we talk about every year. Do you have any tips for folks that may, not have a lot of experience in those areas? Any tips or potential lures? I know you mentioned soft plastics, but I know there's a lot of folks that had expressed interest in giving that a try this year, and any helpful info for, I'll say, a newbie for the salt ponds would be appreciated.
Yeah, so specifically for the cinder worms, I mean, sometimes they are so keyed on the worms, you really got to match the hatch to get them. Obviously, fly fishing, presenting a cinder worm fly is the most effective thing to do. So fly fishermen definitely have a leg up. But there's other ways to present the fly. You could use a casting bubble or a casting egg. You could take a hook off a small popper, put a little floral leader and a cinder worm fly on the back. I've caught fish doing that. You also can use the 4-inch original pink rons. I've caught fish during a cinder worm spawn with that lure. And then sometimes, they are going to eat, whether it's a jumping minnow or a small popper. Last year I was fishing a worm spawn in West Falmouth, and all I had was a popper, and I caught plenty of fish. But sometimes they are super keyed in on the worms. But I've heard of other bait. My buddy was fishing Bourne's Pond and got into what he thought were spearing or silver sides. There was some decent bass, and he was throwing like a small bone SP minnow, and other guys were throwing like the 5-inch pearl savage sand eel, or like a a Pearl GT minnow, something like that, seems to be the ticket. And then, farther down Cape, or if you're fishing on the ocean side, it seems like you're definitely using, bigger plugs, larger SP minnows and long cast minnows, some stuff like that.
Awesome. That's great intel, Evan. And now I know you wanted to give some insight into the boat report as well. So what are you hearing from the boat guys and the striped bass?
Yeah, so, last year I had record of getting into fish at Middle Ground May 7th, 8th, and 9th, and the rips really didn't start to pick up until about Sunday. My buddy got into some slot and some overslot fish. The rip right off the Knobscov, the tip of Lahamadou. There's a lot of squid there. He was throwing soft plastic paddle tails and then amber colored surface plugs. And then I had heard the following day that my buddy was getting into some decent bass at Middle Ground as well. On the south side of Falmouth and the shoals, it's primarily squid, which I've talked about before. So I tend to throw squid colored whatever, whether it's a popper, a spook, or a soft plastic paddle tail. On the south side, it's primarily squid. So as of now, over the last 3 or 4 days, we've really started to see more squid show up and the bass feeding on them in the rips.
Well, that's all great to hear. And it sounds like it's, a promising report overall that there are fish in the area. I know sometimes it takes a little bit longer for fish to kind of make it out that way and around. Sea bass opens up in the next couple of days. And then we also have fluke opening up as well. In terms of those species, any intel on those, or are we still a little bit early?
Yeah, because the season doesn't open till Saturday, I haven't really talked to anybody who specifically targeted sea bass. But,
Sure.
Historically speaking, opening day, if you're in Nantucket Sound, the wrecks are typically, a hot spot for guys. Between Hedge Fence and the Vineyard, there's a couple wrecks, Kershaw and the Port Hunter, both relatively deep, between 55 and 75 feet. So guys fishing that area are going to need, relatively heavy, whatever you're using, a high-low rig with squid or gulp, or if you're using a jig. In that area, I typically fish between 4 and 6 ounces. And then, on the other side of Falmouth, the Buzzards Bay side of Falmouth, Cleveland's Ledge historically has always been a really good spot for opening day sea bass. But, there's so many spots in Buzzards Bay, it's so big. But, those two areas, either the wrecks or Cleveland's Ledge, seemingly is where I typically go on opening day.
Yep, and opening day for sea bass will be May the 18th, and opening day for fluke will be May the 20th. Another species that folks like to target, I'll say in the late spring, as we push toward early summer, but especially in May, are tautog, and I know those have been big over in Buzzards Bay. Have you seen any around the Falmouth area?
Yeah, guys have been getting them on the Vineyard Sound side of the Elizabeth Islands.
Oh, cool.
Around the Lackeys area or Tarpaulin. That whole stretch is really good. So, yeah, guys, I've been selling a lot of crabs. Guys have definitely been getting them there. But I do have a lot of customers who've been fishing Buzzards Bay as well. So the tog bite still seems to be pretty good based off talking to guys in crab sales.
How's the stock and the supply of green crab, in your opinion, this year?
It's been good. They're invasive. They're an invasive species. They're all over the place. So, the supply of green crabs is good. The last couple of years, the supply of sea worms hasn't been as good. And, that's something that guys will use for sometimes sea bass or fluke or scup. But I've seen over the years that's been hard to get. But green crabs it's been a good steady supply over the last few years for sure.
Yeah, and I know scup as well. I get a lot of scup when I'm baiting rigs for tautog or sea bass. If I use squid at all, I'll get a ton of scup, it seems. Are there any signs of scup in your region, Evan? I know it's kind of a byproduct of a lot of guys sea bass fishing, so maybe a lot of guys haven't come up with them yet.
Yeah, no, they're definitely around. I've seen a few. I think some of the squid draggers might have dumped a few over as a bycatch. And so there's a few in front of Falmouth Harbor when I went out the other night. But they're definitely around. I believe it's 11 inches if you're on a private vessel for a scup, which is a pretty big scup. So
Sure is.
It might be a little bit harder this year to find keepers.
And you also mentioned squid, Evan, too, in terms of bait. I know there's some folks that, do squid fishing. It's something that Ryan's done before and tried to video squid whacking the jigs. In terms of, I'll say, squid in your waters, any idea on how thick and where they might be, and also any other bait sources that you've heard reports of floating around, anything like pogies even?
Haven't heard I haven't heard much about pogies. I think on the buzzards bait side of things, someone had mentioned that, but on the south side, there has been a good amount of squid. I went out after work like 3 or 4 days ago. It was slack tide, so I kind of just drove around. And then I marked a big pile of them, probably like 600 yards in front of the mouth of Wacoit.
Got it.
And I've seen the last couple of days, that's exactly where the draggers have been. But my buddy had marked a ton at that tip of Lahamadou. There's a red can between the Rip and Nobska. So that area has had them. I know that my buddy said that when he was fishing at Middle Ground that there's definitely squid popping out of the water there too. I also had heard, which was interesting, someone had called just before I hopped on the podcast and said they had saw some mackerel that were feeding on silver sides in Woods Hole. He said they didn't see any bass on them, but it was interesting to hear that he was seeing some mackerel feeding on those little silver sides. So besides that, it's really primarily squid. Occasionally we will see some pogies move through, and some sand eels as well. But usually this early, it's primarily squid.
Good to hear. And if we're looking forward ahead in time, there's a lot of folks looking to knock the rust off and catch their first striper of the year as we tape this podcast in the middle of May. Any tips for folks that may be trying to target bass in the greater Falmouth area from the beach this weekend in terms of tide? I know we're still kind of, I think, over a week away from the full moon, but just any tips and tides to maybe look out for as we head to the weekend?
Yes. Friday, the high tide is at 7:48 at Falmouth Harbor. So as you go east, it gets later. There's going to be a really nice outgoing tide Friday evening on the south side of Falmouth, which is, in my opinion, the best tide to fish. So, anywhere from Nobska, and that includes Trunk River, Surf Drive, all the way to Katuitt, I think Friday night is going to be a really good outgoing tide in the evening. So that's what I would target. Saturday morning, I believe high tide is around 9 a.m. So I think there's the cheeky tournament, the fly fishing cheeky tournament this weekend too. So there might be a few extra anglers out there, but the last of that incoming in the morning on Saturday could be good, particularly on the inside of the salt ponds, inside of Great Pond, Bourne's Pond, places like that. So those are the two tides I would focus on. And then obviously the following night, Saturday night, high tide's going to be in the evening as well. So it does look like, if you're trying to fish the mornings or the evenings, there should be some good tides around high tide.
That is great to hear, Evan. And in terms of the shop, we're starting off a brand new season of the podcast, and it's a brand new season for kind of all of us here on Cape. And we're still pre-Memorial Day. We're not in prime time yet, but can you give us any updates to the shop and just store hours and anything in general for folks that they need to know?
Sure, yeah. So right now our hours are 8 to 6 Monday through Friday, 7 to 6 Saturday, 7 to 5 on Sunday. For this weekend, we're going to be fully stocked for sea bass, plenty of squid, high-low rigs, jigs, squid scent, whatever you need. It's going to be a good weekend for striped bass fishing. So, whether you're, a lot of guys I talk to are going to try to get that sea bass, get their limit early, and then afterwards try to catch some striped bass. A lot of guys still targeting togs, plenty of crabs for that. So it should be a really good weekend, fully stocked. Anything you need from whether you're gearing up to fish the canal or getting ready for offshore tuna, fishing or you're want to doing some clamming, I got everything you need here. So should be a good weekend weather-wise, I think. So I don't think the wind's going to be too bad, and ready to go.
Perfect, Evan. It was great to catch up with you. It was a long winter. I know it wasn't too bad in terms of snow, but it always just seems to take forever. And I know myself and a bunch of the listeners were all excited to get going and hear from you every other week this year. I think it's going to be a great summer.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the fishing's going to be good. I think the weather's going to be better than last year. So things are looking up.
My thanks to Evan Eastman of Eastman Sport and Tackle in Falmouth, Massachusetts, for joining us on today's edition of the My Fishing Cape Cod podcast presented by Cape Islands Mitsubishi. It was my pleasure to host Evan, and I'll be doing so every other week as we go through the summer and into the fall. And as I mentioned off the start of the program, Evan will specialize in surfcasting reports for the greater Falmouth area, as well as boat reports around the Falmouth area, Vineyard Sound, the Elizabeth Islands, and much more. So great to have Evan back on board for the 2024 season, and that's going to put the wraps on this edition of the My Fishing Cape Cod podcast. Until we chat again, this is your host, Kevin Collins, signing off. Tight lines, and take care.
Thanks for tuning in to the My Fishing Cape Cod podcast. For the latest local news, information, and fishing reports, be sure to log on to myfishingcapecod.com. From all of us at My Fishing Cape Cod, tight lines and take care.